to make sure that families know that life needs to be celebrated.
Welcome, Nick Sanchez. Nick is a Silicon Valley native who has been curious about human interaction and how we connect since a young age. As a lover of the arts and philosophy, Nick spends many hours gathering as much information as possible about how meaning, purpose, death, and existence impact our daily lives and on an individual and communal level. After becoming a licensed marriage and family therapist, Nick began honing his therapeutic skills within the Existential Humanistic Community and is currently seeking clients in his private practice while continuing to study under the leading minds within the Existential Humanistic Community. Welcome.
Thank you.
Nick Sanchez, so excited to have you on the Guiding Grief podcast. And I think for many of our listeners, I think the most appropriate question would be, what drew you to existential humanistic approach to therapy? And then what is it exactly? Maybe the Cliff's Notes version of that.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll go ahead and start with what it is, the Cliff Notes version of that. So what EH, Existential Humanistic Therapy is it's very much an approach that wants to focus on the bigger questions of life. So rather than maybe a client coming into me who's saying, I'm experiencing anxiety and I just want to fix that symptom, it is going to explore more of the idea about like, so what is my purpose of being here? What does like death mean to me? What does it mean for the relationships that I have intimately with individuals? And with that tied into it, the humanistic side of it is going to bring a lot of what we call the here and now into the therapy sessions. And so a lot of what that is going to be, for example, if an event may have happened 2 years ago that the client would like to talk about, what I would be mostly focusing on is what is coming up for them in that moment while they're talking to me, just because our view of situations can change so fast. So over 2 years in that event, for example, maybe the client was pissed off, angry, and now when they're expressing it to me, they're actually experiencing sadness. So what drew me to EH is it causes you to explore parts of yourself that usually are kind of taboo within society. So instead of just, focusing on surface level, it's really trying to explore those deeper topics of just like, why am I here? What is my meaning in life? And with that, I have found that both myself and also the clients that I work with are able to experience a level of self-growth almost on like a daily basis, which I feel a lot of us, especially in Silicon Valley, have kind of stopped doing because of how busy life is.
So it seems like a macro approach versus that micro, like, hey, I'm going to go to this therapy or this psychologist or psychiatrist to diagnose this one thing so that I can maybe get a prescription for it and say, look, I've identified this and let's cure this. But the macro approach, which is overarching, and I don't even know if that's the right word, but it seems like, hey, let's find out who and what you are in your thought process so that we can then identify that so that it gets through to the funnel.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so when you talk about almost Western medicine, so a lot of our Western medicine now is really, let's treat the symptom, but not the actual problem. So as soon as the symptom is gone, we're fixed, we're done with therapy. And so a lot of my work too with clients is they'll get to a place where it's like, I'm able to sleep. I'm having great nights of sleep now. It's been a few weeks of therapy. We're done now. Like, I'm fixed, right? And so it's like, no, like this is when the work starts, right? So
yeah,
it's like now that
the iceberg, right?
Yeah, and it's like, so we're not in this state of crisis per se anymore. So now is the best time to start exploring, like, so what was going on? Like, why did that even come up in the first place? And when you start exploring that, it really allows that lasting change. So a lot of people, again, like especially in Silicon Valley, they want this quick fix, where really it's going to be the quick fix that will help get rid of the symptoms, but that lasting change is going to come from like a lot of hard work and self-exploration within therapy.
Right. I know in any experience that I've had with therapy that it is never a quick fix if you're identifying. And usually what you go in to identify, you need to peel the onion back and you're like, well, I want to get to that thing.
Yeah.
But there's so many things about your past and your history and where you are and whatever part of your brain, prefrontal cortex or wherever it is, that you need to peel back the onion so that you can identify what that specific item is. In that concept, like how do you bring, when someone comes to you with that very Western approach, how do you bring them to that level of awareness that, hey, this isn't going to be a one and done. And they might be coming to you to just tune into that one and done. But do they get to that identification, or you? How does that conversation happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's also a hard one to answer because I would say every client's going to be different. And so usually when a client comes in, the biggest job I have from the first phone call, or however they reach out via email, whatever it be, is how do I meet them where they are, right? So even though I myself have been studying and doing all of this self-growth or all these existential topics, I need to assume that other people probably aren't reading philosophical books on a daily basis.
Right.
So it's really about where are they at? How comfortable are they with emotions? How comfortable are they with identifying? Can they identify emotions? Even just like me. And it's just that idea again of so the first session, you're really coming in and you're meeting me for the first time and you're expected to start pouring your life out, and so it's a very slow process. And so the great thing again about the EH approach, it being a very humanistic, is that I don't have a hidden agenda. So it really allows me to be hey, if where we're at is we're just talking about what you like to do to make yourself feel good. So whether it be going to the movies, going to the beach, is then that's where we're at. And we get to start there. And what happens with me being trained in that approach is that I'm just able to identify certain existential topics that just come up while they're talking that they may not be aware of. And so my job as a therapist would then be, so how do I introduce those topics in a way that is digestible for clients?
Right. One of the things we had talked about offline was level of vulnerability and personal exposure. And, how do you define that line? Because if families or an individual's coming to you to create a trusted relationship, how do you walk that tightrope with who you are and who they are, the client?
Yeah, so that is a huge gray area in the world of mental health. So they usually call it self-disclosure, right? So in sessions, it's a very gray area, and this is going to fall into more of the ethics. And this is just because it's how much of me sharing about my personal self is for my own agenda. So it's am I just enjoying this client and I feel like a friend with you, so I just want to have that relationship? Or is it really coming from a healing place, right? So a perfect example could be if I work with someone who is younger, for example, often just trying to relate to them, and sometimes being hey, I've been through this experience. So talking about death, for example, I would be very comfortable telling oh man, I may be able to relate to and understand kind of what you're going through because I've had my own experiences with death, whether that be one of my family dying and whatnot. And it's kind of just that idea of just normalizing. I would try and stay away from self-disclosure, what do I do on the weekend, for example, because that may not be the most useful thing at that time.
Right, that's maybe oversharing it, and not helping steer. Briefly, you spoke about the here and now, and that abbreviated version of what existential humanistic is, which I imagine you need to work with you for an extended period of time to really understand and embrace it. But how do you bring someone to the here and now?
Yeah, so perfect example. So if I would have a client that were coming in to say, because they're experiencing a level of grief, right? So maybe a family member had just passed away. Focusing on the here and now would be things so say they're talking about, we'll just use grandpa. So say grandpa passed away and that they have all these memories about leading up to that death. They remember seeing him in the bed. They remember the last conversations that they had with him, the feelings that were coming up within that family system, how they felt during service maybe. So what I would really want to focus on, wow, I hear you, but I really want to know, what are you experiencing right now? So as you talk about when you went to grandpa's service, what's coming up for you right now? Can you identify emotion? Can you check in with yourself? Where in your body are you feeling that emotion at? And I really focus on working with that emotion that's coming up for them, because it's easy, especially with grief and death, that you get caught in this place of either thinking outside of your head. So you might be worried more about either the future or the past, and then ignore what's actually coming up for you right now.
Right. So you mentioned an example earlier where someone was angry in the past, but right now they're sad about that. And so to be in tune with why now that is sadness versus that transition from anger, which would be somewhere on the spectrum of grief and how you got there. And then you touched on a thing about the physical, which I don't think a lot of people identify or understand, that when they can tune into their feeling, maybe it's in the shoulders, it's in the chest, it's in the stomach. And how do you help people understand and be be in tune with those physical cues.
Yeah. So sometimes like it's scary and hard to feel emotion. And especially in our society, even males more particularly, we're usually pretty like out of touch. Right. So we think that our mind and body are going to be two different things. So for example, like if I was working with a client and I was like, wow, it's like, what are you feeling again about like your grandpa passing away? And they may say, well, I don't know. I don't feel anything. Like nothing's going on for me. I'm totally fine. I don't really think about it very much. I would challenge them to be like, so when you explore your body, like what does it feel like? Are you tense anywhere just talking about it or even calling out things that I might? So it's like, wow, well, I noticed when you're talking about your grandpa that you actually like your face kind of dropped, or like you're taking some big deep breaths before expressing yourself to me and helping them kind of get in touch with their body. Because a lot of times we are disconnected from those places.
Yeah. Is it staying in the EH perspective and staying in tune with whatever that grief journey is, maybe being more respectful and identifying with those are so that they can be maybe a more helpful path? As opposed to, I mean, obviously burying isn't good, right?
Yeah, and I mean, so everyone's going to grieve differently, right? So in the mental health world, there's been this study and these worksheets that have been passed out about like the stages of grief, right? And so this idea is that we go through different stages, whether it be anger, sadness, depression, and we can also bounce between them. So it's not like this linear process that we go through. So again, though that can be a great resource because it kind of helps clients just feel I'm not alone or I'm like normal, like these are normal feelings that I'm having. Again, the concern would be like focusing on the here and now, you're able to identify where am I at in my grief process right now. Because a lot of clients are like, well, I'm supposed to be grieving this way. And then they'll get caught up in, well, I'm not grieving properly. Right.
It's
like, well, there's no proper way.
Yeah, there's no proper way.
Exactly. There is no proper way to grieve. And what's important is like you as a human are just having that experience, and that's the best part. I mean, I've worked with clients who even are just like, happy that someone died, right? But are like authentically just happy and glad that, someone was able to live a life that they were able to like then exit a life if they were in a lot of pain, from medical and whatnot. And that's an okay way to experience grief. Some people just like to reflect on the positives. Some people like to like celebrate life. Has been like a very new kind of trendy topic that seems to come up is like, instead of having this huge, funeral that's, all black and whatnot, where it's, I just want to celebrate and think of the positive things and almost have a party for this person's passing.
Right. And maybe take a step away from the somber. I celebrate that approach to maybe heighten our awareness of the things in life that we should be in tune with, that made someone's life great versus what's going to wreak havoc in the rest of our lives. We can do that through EH therapy and so many different ways to stay in touch. Anxiety that's associated with how does it impact individuals, and how do you help guide them through the anxiousness of where they are in those steps?
Yeah, definitely. So touching on anxiety with that. So EH has a very, let me re-say this. One of EH beliefs is that we are experiencing what's called like death anxiety. So for example, we would all be experiencing some type of anxiety around an existential crisis, and that they come up in different symptoms. So death anxiety is usually caused by a major rupture happening. So a rupture could be something like a close family member passing away. It could be something like even just watching the news and seeing a tragic event happen. And usually it just forces us to, again, come into the here and now and be like, oh, wow, I am this person who is like on a path to death. And though as morbid as that may sound, it's actually trying to shift that way of thinking. It's like, so in knowing that we have one life, this is not a trial run. Like, how do we keep the idea that we are dying in our heads, but in a positive way, and let it help us experience the life that we actually want to live?
So that anxiety isn't fear-based, or it's turned over to I need to make sure that my cup is filled. This inevitability shouldn't be something that dictates my day in a negative way, but a positive way, and who and how I communicate.
Yeah, exactly. And so many of the clients that I work with, when they first get to me, it will be fear-based.
Right.
So it's like, holy cow, I just realized like I am dying. Right. So it's like, I'm unhappy with my career. I'm unhappy with my marriage. I'm unhappy with, I have kids. Like my entire life sucks. pretty much.
Right.
So I've just now realized I only have one life, right? And so my job is to help them be like, okay, well, let's like take a step back and like actually explore and unpack what is this anxiety about? Because we all are dying. And so how do we just live an authentic life?
To an earlier point, you said, I have anxiousness about death and dying, or I've seen a tragic event. And in my mind, when I created the idea of concept of speaking with individuals like yourself and other leading experts about grief, it was always law space specific to losing a loved one. But people need guidance through grief of seeing tragedy, experience tragedy, the loss of the job. How do you differentiate with guiding someone if it's I've lost a loved one and it's that grief, or I've lost my career or my marriage? Is that different in the approach?
That is a super interesting outlook on it. And I would say that, there would be a commonality in the approach, but just the topic and how we would be talking about death would probably be different, right? So like if I had a client that came to me and said, my grandpa passed away, I realized that I am dying and now I need help with navigating life because I am dying, and like, what's the point, right? If I'm just gonna die, maybe things like that. But another way that someone could come in, it could even be something like of a positive, like super positive experience where it's like, my wife and I just had our first kid. I'm gonna resay that. My partner and I just had our first kid. And I realized that at some point I'm not gonna be here for this person anymore, right? And so even positive events can send us down this road of just, oh my gosh. And it could like happen numerous times. So say someone did experience a death from a family member and they work through it, their death anxiety can almost get rehashed by even another event happening. So it's not something that just goes away. It's something that is there and to be aware of and work through.
Yeah, this was like a recent occurrence for me, that like grief is not specific to the loss of someone in your family, community loss. And I was excited today to be talking with you about that because, supporting people in grief, because grief, if we don't get in tune with what we're feeling and how we're feeling about it, leads to depression and unraveling. And someone comes to you with the loss of a sibling, the loss of a brother. Where do you start in that approach, on the humanistic approach, to make connection?
Yeah, so I would definitely start with building rapport, right? So that could just, again, be I'm meeting the client where they're at emotionally and just having the process of like, we need to get to know each other as human beings before we can honestly like really trust each other enough to even like start exploring these per se like dark topics. And I also think a lot of kind of just really taking a step back and acknowledging where they're at and kind of explaining their experiences. Like, so like you've come to me with like this huge battle that is really taking place, right? And within this battle, there's probably going to be some different ways and different avenues that we can take, and which avenue should we take first? So for example, someone who came to me and said, hey, I just experienced some grief. I had a family member die. My initial assumption would be like, okay, so you're probably experiencing grief in numerous ways. You probably have grief going on about someone you loved who is a part of your daily life or just frequently a part of your life is now no longer there and not going to be there for major events, not going to be there to talk to when you want to talk to them. And another one would be like the realization that I am also a living thing that is going to die, right? And that's like two very huge topics to try and take on all at once and just be like, I have all these feelings coming up for me at this time. So how can I help you navigate and kind of separate two things and just allow you to take off more like bite-sized chunks that would allow that process to kind of be easier in time?
How do you eat an elephant, right?
Yeah.
One bite at a time is the answer to that question. I saw this great image the other day, and that I shared with my family and our grief experience, and it was this just diagram that showed the pit and the path and all the stages of grief, and it wasn't linear. It had movement, and then it showed the actual version, which was that same exact diagram, but it was back and forth because you go through all of those things. Is there normal grief? Is there wrong grief? And how do you balance between someone's belief that they believe theirs is either right or wrong? Or
Yeah, so I definitely don't believe there is right and wrong grief. Yeah, so I definitely don't believe there's right and wrong grief. The way that I would kind of view it is more of how is the way that you are grieving impacting your relationship and like your version of self to the world, right? So it wouldn't necessarily be like, oh, you're grieving wrong or you're grieving right, but it's like, so this way that you are grieving, you are coming to me saying that like you're having a hard time in your marriage, or that like all of a sudden there's a disconnect with you and your child, something along those lines. And so the idea would then be like, okay, so though you are not technically grieving wrong, how you are choosing to grieve is causing other parts of your life to experience a distress. So is there a way that we can explore to kind of like navigate and balance both of those things?
Right, because that Western approach with let's attack the problem and fix the problem. One, if you do that, it's going to be masked and then other symptoms are going to come up. But the symptoms of the grief, if not addressed, are all the things that can unravel in a family if we put too much focus here.
Yeah, and a lot of times, I mean, one of the coping skills that a lot of individuals have, and like as society we've also normalized, is like using substances to mask our emotions, right?
Right.
So it's like, okay, someone passed away, so I'm just going to like drink for the next month and kind of just like put those down. And they may be like, not saying that they're becoming an alcoholic or anything like that, but it's just like, okay, when I start feeling, I'm going to like have a drink and I'm going to manage that way. Or when you come to therapy, it's like very much trying to create a safe place of like, no, like even the bad feelings are the feelings that are really going to help you create a better understanding of yourself and just how you interact with the world. And how can we get to a place like where even though it's going to be uncomfortable, it's still manageable to sit in those bad feelings and really explore those thoughts that are coming up around those feelings.
Right. There's a lot more that can happen in your self-development if you're trying to unearth those things versus continually to brush them under the rug, pushing them to the side, because there's no self-development or evolution in self if you're bearing and masking. How does someone find therapy, whether it's like a Google search, existential humanistic, because the approach itself seems top of my mindful. I understand. I love the concept of how I'm feeling. How does someone find an existential humanistic person, not just your website, but how do you lead them to that approach?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say like the biggest resource that would come to my head right now is Psychology Today. So Psychology Today is also a popular magazine that you see all the time in grocery stores. However, that website is kind of a classified section for therapists. And within there, you can actually put different types of modalities that you want your therapist to have, right? So for example, like existential is one of them. So you could click that box and the therapists that also have that box clicked show up for you.
And what drew you, again, to the approach? And what was it in your life that said, this is the approach that makes the most sense for who I am? I don't just want to be a therapist. I want to, in all of our conversations we've had, I get passionate about your approach because, or the existential humanistic approach, because it just pours out of you. So what drew you to it? What was the life changes or challenges that brought you to it?
Yeah, so it's so funny. I would say that, my wife just made a comment the other day, and it was about how she was making a joke, and it was like, by the time you were out of nursery school, like you probably understood the meaning of life and understood life. And I've always been just such an old soul, and I would probably say like my first existential crisis was when I was like 5. Right. So like these thoughts have just always been with me. It was something I was attracted to. And I would say when I was around the age of 22 and 23, when my grandpa passed away, and that was like the first meaningful person that passed away, was the first time that I was like, oh, wow, like I am a living thing that is dying. And it kind of sent me both on this, downward spiral of like, whoa, what's happening? However, in that time, I was able to step back and I started reading stuff about philosophical and like the meaning of life and whatnot, and just identifying with it and not necessarily looking for an answer to life, like what happens after death, but just like understanding my own thought process and just like what is happening in my mind. So one of the articles that I've read kind of describes this idea that we have these shields in front of us. And pretty much each time a close family member dies, like for example, we have like grandparents as a shield. The next one would be like our parents, and then it's us. So as we have these shields that start going away, it almost becomes a more realistic idea. So this death anxiety usually like will increase as it gets closer and closer to you, because your own, finality becomes a very real thing.
I feel existential crisis is a word that shouldn't be a buzzword and that we should better understand.
Yeah.
Can you describe existential crisis, whether it be grief or something else, that you could say, this is what that is, so that you could identify with it, and then they might be able to find help through existential humanistic therapy?
Definitely, yeah. So I would say I 100% agree with you. It's very much like a pop culture buzzword right now. I would say the broad way of thinking about it is if you're getting to a place where it's like, what am I doing with my life? What is the meaning of my life? I'm not feeling fulfilled is usually like a really common thought. I don't know who I am. So like usually identity questions. So it could be like a job switch or like getting laid off where you're like, well, I was, an engineer and now I'm not an engineer. So who am I?
Right.
It could also be things where, so we touched on death. It can also come up as like big life transitions within your life, right? So that could be like changing relationships, getting married. Usually that is a time where these types of feelings come up. And just check in with yourself then.
And because it is this buzzword and, people associate it with millennial and the undefined, like who are and what we're doing, it's a pretty thoughtful approach. Forever people have been asking, who are you? What are you going to be? Those are pretty overwhelming questions for like the 7-year-old us and the teenager and then the early 20s. It's carrying over maybe a little bit longer, but I think it's a thoughtful approach to stay in tune with.
Definitely.
But having an existential crisis and then not addressing it with, maybe through therapy. And when you're in the community, how do you communicate the benefits of therapy? Because I think everybody knows that, hey, maybe this would be a good idea, or it's never for me. But when you're out there, how do you bring people to therapy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I really, again, just like feel it out. I use myself as a lot of just examples. So like I have no shame in saying I'm in therapy. I'm still in therapy. It's just something that I view as such a huge growth area that I don't see ever stopping, to tell you the truth, therapy. So kind of just like normalizing it. And a lot of it too is we have I was just watching a show the other day, Big Little Lies on HBO.
Yeah.
And in that show, they have a therapist that some of the women are going and talking to. And it was such a bad picture of like what therapy is, because this therapist was like so directed, so like in their face, and just like,
and
no, this is
dark. And that I watched the show with my wife, and it's so dark, and it's kind of like this evil approach that I'm going to be directing this thing.
Yeah, and it was very like, I like felt judged, and I wasn't even in the therapy. So yeah, like when a client would come to me and seek out services, and when I'm trying to figure out where they are at in their process, some initial techniques I might use would be things like, can we do a role play? So when you're talking about the here and now, a great way to bring it into this moment is like, so let's role play. Let's see what it's like. So say again, we're talking about someone whose sibling passed away. All right, so we could do different role plays in regards to, okay, would you like to be you? Would you like to be your sibling? And then I would play the other role. And it could be just a way to hash out some like unresolved feelings, or if there, a lot of times clients may, say, I wish I would have had time to have this conversation with them. And again, it's not that you're going to get the content maybe that you wanted, but you at least get like the physical experience of what would have been like to have this.
When you do something like that, do you, and they say, well, I want you to be the sibling or the grandfather or the deceased. Do you try to get a little background information on that so you could maybe answer and engage at the best? Because you said the content's not going to be
exactly
there, but is that something that you would do to get into those shoes as best as possible?
Definitely. And I mean, obviously, like you brought up, it's going to be really hard because I'm not that person.
Right.
And so usually it's just asking them, so what would be most helpful? Would it be me pretending to be this person, knowing that I'm not going to be able to replicate them? Or it could even be like, do you want to write down some specific things you want me to say, just so you can experience what that's like and what comes up for you again, right? So the whole purpose would be like, wow, what was that like for you? So what was that exchange like for you? Another thing that we could do is called like an empty chair technique, which is going to be more of Gestalt based. And he was a lot of it in the here and now too, where it's like, okay, so just take me out, but let's do a role play where you're going to talk to this empty chair and we'll put that person in that chair. So then it allows the client just to have this conversation without having to necessarily worry about, oh, my grandpa wouldn't have said things.
They wouldn't. Yeah. You're not trying to do accents at that point in time, right? It's not that level of theater. But if you mentioned writing letters, and I've found peace in writing letters. Is that something that is ever within therapy over time that's time capsuled? Because when you write that, like you're feeling that, and that was then, and then maybe if you wrote a letter today, is that?
Yeah, that's like, so a great example of how I would touch on that would be, I had a client one time, and she actually did that. Her sister had passed away unexpectedly, younger sister. And so she was having a really hard time with processing that. And so we did this experiment per se, where it's like, so let's write a letter to your sister of all the things that you would say to her, because her experience was very much an event had happened which caused her sister to have to go directly into the ER, and within a few hours she had passed away within the ER. So it was completely unexpected. She didn't have any time to like process it. She didn't even like hear about it until it had been done.
Yeah, devastating.
Yeah, exactly. And so she was just really stuck in that place. And it was there was like guilt that she was experiencing a lot at that time, as far as like, it should have been me, I'm the older sister, I should have gone first type of situations. And then just a lot of like, well, I wanted to have these conversations because she had moved away from her hometown. And so what I asked her to do was like, well, let's try and write a letter. And if you were just to write a letter to your sister, how short, how long, whatever you want it to be, it could be literally 10 pages, it could be a sentence, whatever you need. And so her homework assignment that week, because she asked for homework, was to go home and to write a letter, which she did. And when she brought it back, touching on the time capsule piece, I had her read it to me out loud. And I really focused on, so what is coming up for you right now after reading that, right? So like, I provided space to talk about what was it like to write a letter to her? What were some of the things? Oh, interesting. Like, why would you want to have that conversation with her? But I really also wanted to focus on, what is it like for you? What is it stirring up for you emotionally right now, just in reading this back to me?
Right. I'm the flood, because then you're actually getting to that. This is how I'm feeling now. Exactly. That's how I was feeling now.
Exactly.
But then this is how I'm feeling now, because I'm reading it out loud. And
exactly.
Like, how am I even channeling that same thought I was having? Because it's going to be new and different. Because your intersection point has changed.
Exactly. And as humans, and especially like, so there's also a form like existential psychotherapy is going to be very heady, very philosophical. And as humans, we tend to be very heady, very, not focusing on our bodies. And so what's great with the EH approach is that it's kind of like holding up a mirror, where it's like, nope, like, what are you feeling right now? Right. And then if they start going off and like, well, I'm thinking about this, or it's like, okay, but how does that make you feel? Which kind of makes them like really take a look in themselves. And it's like, wow, like right now.
Ever present.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
We're just staying in tune. I can see the benefits and my past 5 years and all the places that I've been, about how I wish I would have had this conversation then, so I could have been constantly in tune. I know that in our world of, especially in funeral service and celebrating life, there's a huge section of spirituality, religion. If someone's coming to you, like, how do you filter through someone's religious perspectives as they're coming at you? And is it just trying to stay at the human approach because they're bringing their religion, culture, and faith with them?
Yeah. So, I mean, and again, what's great about the humanistic approach is that I have no box I'm trying to fit you in. It just allows me to understand where my client is coming from, and whatever their beliefs are, that's what I work with, right? So even if I don't necessarily agree with their beliefs, have the same thought process around like what happens when you die, right? That really does not matter, because what matters is like, well, what are you feeling right now around dying in that moment? And I work with so many different clients around, I'm either a very spiritual person, and especially now in this time, that is like such a loaded question, because it's like, what is being spiritual? What does spirituality even mean? And then I also have clients who are very much like, I come from Catholic faith, or I come from Christian faith. And again, it's just exploring that, because perfect example could be, I had a client who was coming in from a very Catholic background, and she had someone passed away, and she was convinced that her loved one was going to hell. Convinced, because of her Catholic belief. And so it's not for me to even like start questioning, well, is religion real? Doesn't matter. What matters is like, let's talk about your concern about your loved one going to hell. And with her, it was this idea of like, well, I'll never be able to see them again. So when I go, and if I get into heaven, like, I won't be able to ever see this person again.
Right. That's a lot to unpack. I mean, that's a box that we've put ourselves into, that you have to, through this approach, help to unpack and identify. Because that's a heavy thought. I'm getting to the afterlife. I believe that, and this person is not going to be there because of whatever decisions they've made. How has working in this helped with your spirituality or connection with day-to-day life? I know we kind of touched about the ever-present portion of it, but
yeah, I would say it's really helped me understand the importance of being present and being in the moment per se. So if you were to think about worrying about the future is going to be more a cause of like anxiety, where if you're thinking a lot about the past, it's usually a form of like sadness or depression about something that's already happened. So when you are doing those things, you're really closing yourself off from what is happening in this moment, right? So say that we were having this conversation right now, but however, I'm super anxious about if I had like some huge test coming up that I had to take next week, right? So even though we are having this conversation, I'm actually being and thinking about the future. And what's sad is that touching on, we all die at some point, is that like all I have is right now. So I have no idea what is going to happen in an hour. I have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. Like I could die. I have no idea, right? So do I really want to spend that time worrying about the future? Or if I can like really authentically be present in this moment and like appreciate what is happening right now?
I feel like the EH is so incredibly important right now, just based on that ever-present device that's in front of people that is always looking at what somebody else is doing.
Yeah.
And if they're sitting and spending time with someone like yourself, they're shut off for a little bit and they can actually be present. Because I think that so often we're not.
Yeah.
In our life today, moves super fast. We have all this information. How do you help counsel individuals or guide them in to staying away from that? I mean, that's a scary thing in the world we live in.
Yeah, it brought up such an interesting, I had this recent experience with a client, and she described this time to me where she was texting on her phone and she had a family member pass away. So she was texting her mom because her mom was sad about this member of family passing away. She was also texting her friend who was getting ready to adopt a new puppy. So they were super excited. And then she was also texting her sister who had just had a kid, right? So now in this sense, you are now like almost per se like splitting yourself emotionally. And so it's this idea, and like we talked about this existential thought of like, so in splitting yourself emotionally, I mean, you're experiencing, sadness, excitement, happiness. Are you experiencing any of those emotions wholeheartedly in one? And are you like pretty much like gypping yourself from the actual experience of experience?
Yeah, you've had no time to identify with one thing, because you can communicate with those through people faster than you even just told me about it, right? So no one is, not no one, but it's so hard to be in that moment.
And it's exploring, like, is the client even open to that, right? So if a client were to come to me and say, well, I spend all my time on social media, but like they're happy and that's like, they love doing that, I'd be like, okay, maybe I'd bring it up and just like explore it further, but it's like, well, if that's not creating a problem. However, oftentimes like I'll get clients that come in and they're like, well, my significant other, my partner is constantly complaining that I'm on my phone during dinner time. Right. And so in that sense, we'd be talking, okay, so let's focus on the here and now, because what your partner is actually asking is, I want to be present with you in this very moment.
Something I want to touch on. So you're in a community, you're sharing, someone comes to you and they've found existential humanistic approach, and you start talking about getting in touch with the body and where you're feeling in the here and now. I imagine if someone's come to you, they're ready to have and do work, but I imagine sometimes that individual shows up and like, what is this voodoo, Nick, and what are you talking about? And this is, how do you bring someone to it? To me, it makes sense, and I get it.
Definitely. And it's so funny because the hardest thing about existential and EH approaches is explaining it, right? Because it's very much one of the things where it's like you just need to experience it. So even like being trained in it, it was hard to just read books. Like I needed to actually go to a training. I need to like talk to other people who are practicing it to understand what's going on. And so what I have found, I had this happen actually yesterday. I had a potential client reach out to me, and their first question for me was like, well, what modality, what framework do you work from? Because I hate like hypnosis. And they had this idea about things that they hated. And I was like, all right, well, I don't really say, hey, I'm an EH therapist, or I like work existentially. I just explain my values and beliefs like about working with clients. So I explain like, wow, I'm like really value you as a person. I want to get to know you. And like one of the ways I describe is like, if I wouldn't have coffee with you outside of the session, we probably like wouldn't be a good fit. Right? Because like what matters is that connection. So I'll explain it in ways like that, because what I have found is though people may not know what EH is, a lot of them, like as humans, we want that authentic connection to be seen, to be heard, to be like unconditionally loved by another person. And when you explain what that looks like in therapy, most of the time people are like, that's exactly like what I want. Like that's the type of relationship I want to have. Right?
Yeah.
Or if I were to say, well, I do existential humanistic, they'd be like, what? Like what's
We'll dive a little deeper here. So you're focusing on that connection. And, but I like that concept. If we probably couldn't have coffee together, maybe we might not be a good fit. And that's okay.
Yeah,
because if you're searching for therapy, for anything, you need to find someone that you trust and can openly communicate with.
Yeah, and it goes both ways, right? So I mean, even there's times where like I personally don't feel that I would be a good match for a client who thinks I would be a good match, just because, again, it's just that relationship. It's not saying they're a bad person or like they're weird or anything, but it's just like there's something that I feel could block that truly authentic relationship from forming and from happening.
Do you ever find in the therapy world that you're working to get to the safe, comfortable place where you're having open and honest conversations that are, protected and all these other things.
Yeah.
But there's this withholding, this constant withholding that that there's more there and they're not willing to share. And is that your job to continue mining, or do you say, hey, listen, if you're not going to share, I can't help? Or
so I just don't mind. How I see it is that they're not at a place, whether that be they're not comfortable enough, whether that be they're not ready to process it. And I just let it be. And it's so funny when you bring that up, because oftentimes I'll have like what's called like a doorknob confession. So it's like as a client's leaving and they touch the doorknob, they're like, oh, by the way, XYZ, right? And it's just like, oh, okay. But usually when that happens, I'm like, I'm not like a mind reader by any means, but it's like, I'm usually not surprised. I'm like, oh, okay. Like that makes a lot of sense in my head. And sometimes it's just knowing that the other person is not going to judge you. So usually what I have found is that if I have a client where I can tell is like they are holding or there's something going on between us that is like, seems like we're not building that connection, I actually call it out. So a very humanistic existential approach would be like addressing our relationship and how I experience you. Because if I'm experiencing you in this way, other people in the real world are also probably experiencing you per se. So I'd actually say like, hey, I'm noticing that there seems to be some distance in the way I'm experiencing our relationship, is that there may be some things you want to talk about, but maybe don't feel comfortable talking about. Can we talk about that right now? So not even touching on like, hey, tell me this information, but like, no, let's just talk about, because they're probably feeling it as well.
That shield or that wall.
Exactly. And is it something I'm doing? Is it something between us? Maybe we're not working well together. And it could be as simple as them saying, I'm just not ready to go there yet.
Yeah.
But at least then we can let's talk about why, not necessarily just on you, but is it me? Is there something that's going on? Can we address it differently?
Gosh, the amount of individuals that I'm honored to have cared for in my life, and I just I know that one of the things that doesn't happen often enough in the world is grief therapy and the focus, be it in a group or otherwise. That people can share and find commonality. Because I think in grief, we're never alone, but we put ourselves in a place that we are. Do you do group settings with individuals? Is that something that you lead or would want to lead? Yeah,
so I have done groups in the past. I'm not currently doing groups. However, I'm totally open to it. I do see there being a lot of benefit from group work, as you were saying, where it's just normalizing like, okay, other people are experiencing grief like me, aren't experiencing grief like me. And it could be a numerous thing of just having that support group, hearing how other people are dealing with it, even just having other individuals to talk to about it. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll actually refer some individuals like to support groups in the area. Sometimes it's hit or miss. Some clients, and I can even use myself. I've been to group processing where I'm like, okay, that was a waste of time. Did not like that. And it could be numerous. It couldn't even be that it was facilitated badly, but it could be like, okay, that stirred up too much in me, and I just like did not like that situation. Right. Maybe the group's been established for a while. They're all meeting, and you're walking in new and fresh, and I'm not ready to be that exposed in that type of environment. But it could be a great thing. And this touches even more like what I challenge clients to do is like, dude, let's have these conversations like with family members, right? So even though, because it's such a weird thing to have these existential, conversations or thoughts, or even just saying like, I'm worried about dying. That's like usually not a conversation that for whatever reason doesn't come up with family members, where it should be, because it's like we're all there. We should all be able to talk about it and help process each other as a family. Right, and that's your
that's your core group. That's your intimate level. And sometimes those are the individuals like, oh, we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about death. Everything's going to be fine.
Well, then you start activating their own, like death anxiety. So if I came to you and it was like, man, I'm going through a really hard time with this death, and like I'm starting to think about my own death, and then you could be saying like, well, now I'm like freaking out about my own death, so I want to talk
right.
about
This is a spiral. But if it needs to be a constant conversation, and maybe it's not what you're having coffee over every morning, but at least in that mental place where you're identifying with, I'm going to give my best self today, and not mail it in.
And taking everything, not taking it for granted. Like, waking up yesterday, actually, I just sent one of my close friends a text, and I was like, hey man, like, thank you for being such a positive impact on my life. Right. And it has nothing to do with like, I'm going to die today. But it's like when you hold that thought in your head, or it's like, this could be it, or it's just like, it makes you want to express yourself more and to like feel those positive emotions as well.
Right. To have that, that's where you want to lead folks to is if you reach out and if you connect, I don't know, that's enriching. I've been an individual that remains in contact with individuals. And I do that thing where you send a message of gratitude or appreciation. And it's amazing that the meme or quote I read the other day was that if you're having a bad day, make somebody else feel better.
Yeah.
Right. And positivity comes from that, because that's how we're feeling it. Would that be in the world? Like continuing to put it out there?
I think it definitely would, in regards again to like the type of relationships that you're trying to form. So like when you're talking about your authentic self is probably an individual who like actually wants to experience deep, meaningful relationships. And on that, you're probably wanting to help people, I would say.
That's part of that thing. I'm on the couch right now, for sure. What are you working on? I know you mentioned Kirk. Who's Kirk? What does Kirk do in Existential Humanistic, and how do you get to work with him?
Definitely. So there's a group called the Existential Humanistic Institute. It's in the Oakland area, and it's pretty much a huge training center for therapists who just want to gain that understanding of the EH approach and understand it. So Kirk Schneider is actually pretty much like our not leader, but our main spokesman for the EH community. So he is the individual that's writing all the books. He's the person going to conferences and trying to help people understand this approach. And so I've been lucky enough to train with him over the course of this past year in numerous environments. So going to like week-long retreats where we had a lot of one-on-one interaction with just helping and like doing role plays and whatnot. And then what I do with him now is I actually seek out consultation, where I meet with him on a pretty regular basis, usually like twice a month, where we just like talk more about the approach, talk about understanding case conceptualization, how to keep people in the here and now and whatnot. And this person, has so much wealth, and the best way to get that knowledge is just to like pick his brain and understand his thought process around it.
Right. That's a pretty wonderful thing. If you're going to get better, be with the best. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
It continues to hone your skill, increase. How do I keep myself in the here and now?
So there's I'll just share some things that I've tried to do with myself. And so touching back kind of, to when my grandpa passed away was kind of the first time where like I went off the handlebars and I was just like all over the place. I was like living in the future, living in the past. And so actually an exercise that I did, and by all means, this is a little extreme, but I actually set a timer on my phone that would go off on the hour, every hour that I was awake. And what I would do is when it would go off, I would check in with myself and just, okay, what am I thinking about right now? What am I feeling right now? Physically and mentally. So even saying, okay, it's like right now I'm feeling like content right now. Okay, how does my body feel right now? Okay, it's like it feels a little stressed out. What's going on? Is like something around me is stressing me out and whatnot. And just going about my day. So by no means is it like I need to sit down for half an hour and process this. It's just like a quick 1 to 5 minutes to check in with yourself. And what I found it helped with me was that when I would start getting heady or start worrying about the future, every hour I would be reminded to come back down for a second.
Right, just to ground yourself. Gosh, I can hardly listen to this thing when it tells me to breathe. That is like an incredibly thoughtful thing to be able to do throughout the day. But something that you subscribe to, is there something more scalable, or through your experience that maybe not every hour, maybe other techniques that a listener could say, okay, that's something that I could keep myself in the here and now?
Definitely. So, meditation. If people are open to meditation, that could even be just like a 5-minute day exercise and practice. But I would say even beyond that, some ones that I have found really helpful is, and that I'm continuing to do right now, is going for what's called like the mindful walks and just being present. So perfect example, like walking here, when I got in my car, I told myself, all right, in my 2-minute jaunt over to this building, I'm going to notice one thing about this area that I've never noticed before. And I've lived in this area for like close to 17, 18 years now. And so, I've like know this area like the back of my hand. And what that does is, again, instead of thinking about, oh, how is this interview going to go? What's happening right now? It was just like, so I need to focus on what exactly is happening and like choose one thing that stood out to me, right? And so, for example, my one thing was like, oh, wow, like the birds in that tree are really beautiful. And it's just something simple like that. But again, it forces my mind to be like, oh, what's going on? Let me like live in the present. Let me not start getting heady and worrying about the future.
Yeah, that is, my wife on a daily basis always reminds me when we're with our 2 children, it is about the journey and not the destination.
Yeah, exactly.
To be present, to walk down the street and someone wants to stop 10 times. Stop 10 times, because if we don't get there, if we had fun along the way, we'll just turn around and come back. I think she actually lives this life a lot better than I do as it relates to that existential approach. Building Silicon Valley therapy counseling services. How's it going? What was the impetus? How did you create this and your approach, and what's the big plan?
Yeah, so it's going really well. Kind of where I was just at with it, whereas I've been spending close to the last 10 years working in numerous different environments as far as doing some agency work with like nonprofits. And I was also working at a group practice. And what I kind of found in working in those two is that though I was the one providing the services, I didn't necessarily have a lot of control over the type of therapy and the type of change that I really wanted to create for those clients. And that's what kind of caused me to kind of reach out and start exploring the existential humanistic world. And in doing so, I was like, I can really affect a lot of people in using this approach. And that's where Silicon Valley therapy came in. And I really just opened that up to help me kind of better assist the tech community, the busy professional, and just everyone really living in the Silicon Valley, and have this crazy busy lifestyle, and how can I best serve them? So right now it's just me. However, over the next few months, I plan on bringing on other people to help provide even more help, provide more services and all that.
Not fully within the EEH, but just different people with different approaches, or
exactly.
all in one.
Yeah, exactly. So different approaches. It could be things like support groups. It could be things like running workshops, going to like local libraries and just giving lectures like that right now. I actually have something in the works where I'm working with one of the biggest family law firms in Silicon Valley, and I'm going to go there and kind of do like a fishbowl thing where it's just like, I'm here for 4 hours and like come talk to a therapist for 10, 15 minutes. Come like pick my brain, just trying to check in with me, and really going back to that idea of like, how can I impact as many people as possible to help get them somewhere that they want to be in life.
Even with a short 15-minute tune-in to
exactly
look in the mirror, have that identification.
Exactly.
I'd love to do something with our families and grief and providing them access. I think it's such an important thing for them to have someone to reach out to, or multiple individuals in our community that say, this is someone who has strength in helping you be ever present and be in the here and now. There is, if listeners wanted to work with you, what's the best way to reach out? What's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so the best way to reach out is going to be either through, I do text messaging as well as email. You can link them.
Yeah, I'll definitely place all the links in the notes, and then
awesome.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but definitely, yeah. So I'm usually in sessions and doing things throughout the day, but I'm pretty fast to respond. And even if it's a simple question as like, what is the process of starting therapy? How do I find a therapist? Like, I'm not just here to get clients for myself. Again, I'm really just trying to get people connected with the right individuals to better help them.
Right, so they can do good work, help themselves. One of the things I like to do, just based on the fact that I am a funeral professional and serving families in our community, is to have kind of like a speed round of questions. And the first question would be, if there was going to be music at your service, what would it be and why?
Everything just came to mind. I would say Dave Matthews Band.
The D&B. All right.
Yeah, right? Like throwing it back to the 90s.
Yeah.
Yeah, why? Because they're amazing. They're like one of the first big bands I saw live.
Yeah.
I used to play drums, so like I was totally taken away by their performance.
I feel like the drums was actually almost, Dave Matthews' voice was so incredible, but the drums was like this other vocal that was happening all the time.
Exactly. Yeah, I totally agree. And like the great thing about Dave, because we're on a first name basis,
Yes.
The great thing about Dave is that I feel like he really covers like the whole spectrum of topics, which is amazing. So like he has songs about love, about happiness, but he also challenges again like death and like addiction that he's overcome, which just to me is phenomenal.
Wow. That's an enormous catalog that we might have to come back
right?
to.
Yeah, seriously.
Including all what would you say? And like, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Anyone that could preside over, you're gone, there's going to be someone's going to be over your service, and it could be in the past, today, or in the future. Obviously in the future, who would you want to preside over services?
Wow. The first person that came to mind was Bob Marley. And I don't like his overall just sense of like love and well-being. Like I couldn't even imagine even if he didn't know who I was, just like what type of knowledge he would just drop on people.
Yeah.
That's it.
Burial or cremation? Is it a thought you've ever had?
It is. So I would definitely go with cremation. Kind of interesting though, because I did just read an article that was talking about Asian cultures who bury you and then like they also plant a tree. And so the idea is that you become part of this like bigger system in life, which kind of resonated with me. But at the same time, I don't know, being buried kind of freaks me out.
It's a question that my wife and I still grapple with, and I've been doing this for 20 years.
Yeah.
So we've covered music, someone to preside over services, burial, cremation. Do you have a service? I mean, if Bob's there, then there's definitely going to be a service. Right. But is that something that I think many times families come to us and like, oh, we're not going to do a service. Something that you believe in strongly, that's part of the path, or where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've been grappling with this back and forth probably since I was like 10, to tell you the truth. This idea of even having like a site where people could visit my ashes. I'm not totally sure how I feel about like being at one specific place rather than people just like being able to touch in with me wherever they are. And I'm not sure how I would feel about having a service or even like a celebration of life. I don't know, it almost to me seemed like egocentric to think like there's going to be this event around me, which could be my own stuff coming out. But I don't know, like I think I would really place it on my partner and just be like, hey, if people want to have something for me, then like let them. And again, going back to like, how do people want to grieve? Because at that point I've come and passed, and how I would want that to happen is how can I best support these people in processing my grief?
Absolutely. I understand that ego portion of like, well, because so many times we meet families and like, yeah, we're not gonna do anything.
Yeah.
But that person is gone, and it's like, hey, we gotta take pause and tell the story. I'm opposing beliefs at this point in time. Right?
And I also like the idea that people could potentially talk about death around me. So I mean, that's kind of cool. That'd be my ultimate goal.
Right, an opportunity. And there's a lot of people gathering to talk about their existential humanistic approach. So this is great work at that point in time. This has been Guiding Grief, talking with Nick Sanchez about existential humanistic therapy and his approach on helping the Silicon Valley and our community be better in touch with themselves, being able to look in the mirror when you're having feelings and thoughts. And I've enjoyed the many times that we've had coffee, the first time we met, and then I'm grateful that you have come on to be a guest on Guiding Grief.
Definitely.
And if you're ever looking for someone to have a conversation with about therapy, whether it be existential, humanistic therapy, I would highly recommend reaching out to Nick Sanchez. He is a friend and an incredible individual.
We need to make sure that families know that life needs to be celebrated.